Well, it all boils down to opinion, and facts are important here because in the 1950s, the Soviet Premier Khrushchev gave Crimea, awarded a jurisdiction to Ukraine, uh, and so Russians had felt historically that Crimea was a part of Russia. Uh, Russian control of Crimea began in 1789 with the annexation invasion of Crimea. And so it basically had been a part of the Soviet Union for a period of time, Russia. And then when Ukraine became independent because of what the Soviets had done in the 1950s, they turned it over to Ukraine. And so Ukraine, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it became part of Ukraine. So in February of 2014, right after the Sochi summit, the Russians invaded Crimea, occupied it, and seized it, and annexed it. After the revolution called Maidan had occurred in Ukraine and brought inside Ukraine a new government that was very nationalistic. So the Russians feared that they might lose access to their naval base in Crimea called Sevastopol.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a very long, complicated story, but the Russians maintain that they have had it for because they took it in 1789. They feel that historically they're justified in getting it. So it's a very complicated region. It has great military significance to Russia, and Russia, since it occupied Crimea, has been able to turn Crimea into a platform for projecting military power into the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean. Consequently, there are Russian submarines in the Mediterranean that are tracking American carrier battle groups, and part of that's been made possible because of what happened with Crimea. The Russians, when they gained full control over it, were able to turn it into an island aircraft carrier, and were able to project power. So, it's had great strategic implications for the United States. When the Russians militarily invaded Crimea in February of 2014, there were Ukrainian military units and bases inside of Crimea, and these units were basically surrounded. Many of them were forced to surrender. So they tried to avoid bloodshed. So when the Russians went in, there was definitely a capability on Ukraine's part. They had about 15,000 military soldiers inside of Crimea, and they could have fought back if they had been received orders to, but they weren't because of they wanted to avoid the bloodshed, and they didn't think they would be successful against the Russian. Well, they definitely feel cheated. If you ask the Ukrainians that, if you ask a Russian, they feel that what they did was legitimized.
Hmm.
First of all, they had already had an existing naval base in Sevastopol that was a leasing agreement that they had with Ukraine. So what they did was they just formally annexed Crimea and said, we already have a base here. So, forget the basing agreement. It's now part of Russia. And what they did was illegal, according to international law, and it was a
Hmm.
preemptive military attack. Uh, so, so it's similar in nature to kind of similar things that the Russians have done in the past when they invaded Afghanistan in 1979. The exact same thing. So it was a very preemptive attack, and where they moved in with excessive force. But we're not in the Cold War now, so there's a vast difference. The West keeps thinking that we can keep invoking other sanctions, but Putin is um, what we consider someone like of a quality of the 19th century, of like Bismarck. He believes in what they call blood and iron. That and Bismarck had a phrase that said that the great speeches of the day will not be resolved by idle talk, but by blood and iron. And what he meant was use of force. So what you've seen in Ukraine and other conflicts around Russia is a willingness to use a limited amount of military power to regain what it wants to achieve that it cannot achieve politically. And it's used that as a resort to basically bully other countries that are smaller uh, and to try to enforce its will. I think that the Russians cannot they claim Crimea, but the problem is all the water in Crimea comes from Ukraine. So so basically Crimea is drying up. And so if you look at the satellite maps of Crimea, you'll see big brown bare spots in Crimea that have occurred in the last 5 years. And that's because the areas, the water is they're not getting the water from Ukraine, and that's causing a lot of they can't grow the crops basically. So they have to import all their water. So the way the Russians got around this is by building a bridge across the Kerch Straits. So so this is a type of thing. They built a bridge and they're trying to bring things in now, and that's what they're trying to achieve. But you know, Crimea is something that they will basically go to great effort to try to make sure that it's a part of Russia, because it does have great strategic importance to them. None of the other nations of the Black Sea have really built up their naval capabilities, and the Russians have been investing for 20 years in building and expanding their navy in the Black Sea. So they're really the top dog in the Black Sea, and not many. Only the United States Navy can do anything to try to stop them. And certainly Turkey could, but they have very strong, estranged relations with the United States over our support for the Kurds in Syria. You're referring to the Budapest Memorandum that was signed between the United States, where Ukraine gave up 3,000 nuclear weapons in assurances to gain assurances from Russia and the United States that we would guarantee their territorial sovereignty. And we chose to ignore that. And recently, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, William Miller, just died, and he was present at those meetings. He had long told people here in Washington, including me, that he was in the meeting with President Clinton at that time, and Clinton did give Ukraine those assurances. Many people try to dispute that fact, but the United States did. And the point is that Ukraine is a country that produces long-range nuclear missiles, used to produce them for the Soviet Union and for Russia, and it has missile capabilities. So Ukraine is no small country to push around. And it's very important. What you're alluding to is the fact that it could one day go nuclear again, and it may. You know, they have the missile capabilities to reach Moscow, and it's a very short distance for them, and it's something that concerns the Russians, and so you know, Ukraine does have very good scientific and also defense industrial base that gives it those qualities.
There's been like a lot of U.S. politicians like Corey Lewandowski and Steve Bannon who have been associated with Ukraine and Russia. And
who hasn't? Who hasn't? Sorry,
so
talk to Hunter Biden.
Hunter. I mean, why are there so many U.S. politicians associated with this region and economic growth and that sort of thing? Is there, I don't know, some sort of gold rush for businesses and oil in Russia going on right now among politicians? I'm really not sure.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say that, you know, Rudy Giuliani is not interested in Ukraine because of its oil. He's interested in Ukraine because he believes that's where the CrowdStrike servers were located. He's trying, you know, Hunter Biden was there because his father was the vice president of the United States. And so it enabled him to get access to very rich contracts using his influence. That's what Washington does very, very well. Politicians and their families benefit from the close ties that they have with foreign leaders and governments. So, and Republicans and Democrats both do this. So, you know, it's very common. Just to say that Trump or Giuliani were guilty of it is not true. I mean, this has been very, very common on both sides of the aisle. So I'll just leave it at that.
What do you think the future of this conflict is going to look like? Do you think we'll continue in this weird limbo, or do you think there will be an actual diplomatic resolution?
Boy. I think it's not going to change for the time being. It's going to go on. There's a phrase called frozen conflicts, which refers to some of the wars that have been fought in the post-Soviet space, like in Georgia, country of Georgia, not the state, but the country of Georgia, Moldova, and Donbass, or what they call frozen conflicts, that it's just going to go on indefinitely. And it's occupied by the Russians, and no one's willing to resort to force to change it. So I think things are going to kind of remain the same, but it can always change, because history is very, very dependent on personalities. There would be no talk of China today if it wasn't without Trump. So I think that he's changed the dynamics of the way we look at China. So I'm a firm believer that people can shape history, and they can play certain roles. But it may, the person that we may come after Trump may be completely different, and will be different. And so these frozen conflicts will go on probably for some time, until somebody decides to use, either Russia has a major crisis again, like it did in 1991, and starts to dissolve, because Russia still is an empire. It still consists of many different nationalities that are not just Russian. And that's one way. The other way is that another country could militarily surprise Russia and take, like Ukraine, could get enough military force to retake Donbass. So anything is possible.